Welcome back. This is Christine Flowers sitting in for Chris Stigall. This is when the show gets really good, when it's not just me yammering on, but I get to welcome in some really great guests. And, Eddie and I get to welcome in some really great guests. The numbers here, because you're really the best guest of all, you who are listening, is 610-850-0990 if you want to weigh in. Before the break, I mentioned that I was going to have on as a guest Ben Maness. And I read you a little snippet from his piece on basically media malpractice, which is the lack of focus, balance on the part of the media with respect to what is really happening in the city of Philadelphia. It seems like we're more interested in prosecuting statues for past crimes that these statues have committed than looking at what's happening in the city of Philadelphia. I found it ironic, and I had posted on Facebook that there were a lot of college students marching through the city of Philadelphia last weekend protesting in support of Black Lives Matter, while at the very same, or actually protesting against police brutality, while at the very same time 23 people were shot. Two of them being children, I believe. I don't remember what the fatality rate was, but at least two people were killed as well. None of those people were killed or shot by police officers. So I think, there is a disconnect there. And Ben wrote a great piece at Broad and Liberty, so I wanted to have him come in and discuss it with me. Hey, Ben, how are you?
Morning, Chris. How you doing?
Great. I'm so glad you could join us. Really loved your piece at Broad and Liberty. I love Broad and Liberty to begin with, but I really loved the piece that I read, and I was ready to just read the whole thing on air, but I think it's much better to have you talk about it, and then later we can direct people as to how they can read it for themselves. But what motivated you to write this particular piece at this particular time?
Well, I've been writing about this stuff for quite a while, and last week was a media blitz in relation to this specific issue of how, A, crime is out of control, not just in Philadelphia, but Philadelphia is leading the pack right now. B, the media is a contributor, and C, the media is basically covering for, a large swath of corruption on the political level. So what I did was a blitz. Broad and Liberty was my long-form local piece. I like that they let me, when I'm covering a Philadelphia-specific issue, they let me go long and tell the entire story. Because nowadays in the media, they want you to cover everything in 700 to 800 words.
Right, it's all soundbite.
Yeah, well, to be blunt, that's part of the problem. Even on the TV or the radio, you can't cover these issues simply. They're not simple issues.
Exactly.
So I did the piece in Broad and Liberty. I did a piece for BigTrial because Ralph Cipriano lets me get, very deep onto the actors. He basically doesn't care if they target him because they have in the past.
Another great website. Plug for Ralph. He's fabulous.
Yes, BigTrial.net for all those specific to Philadelphia inside issues that they are not covering at the Inquirer because, let's face it, the Inquirer doesn't want to cover it. And then I did my national. I have a column in Newsmax, as do you. But my Newsmax column basically covered it on a national level because this is a national issue. But it's at the extreme in Philadelphia because people like Jim Kenney and Larry Krasner, this is not an issue of progressive values versus, traditional values. This is an issue of they have found a way to get away with extreme amounts of malfeasance and corruption with no one watching because they're doing it under the guise of race and politics and, progressivism.
Bingo.
And they're sacred cows. And the problem with having sacred cows is people are often afraid to, dispel those myths and speak truth to power, which is desperately needed on a political level. And the press, which used to be the fourth estate, which used to work as a check and a balance to basically just buying the story coming out of City Hall, is not doing that. As long as they're speaking to the beliefs that they want, the same political values that their reporters hold, they're ignorant to the fact that the statistics are telling a far different story, as you alluded to, than what is happening on these protest marches.
Yeah, not to get down on the Inquirer, which is something I'm perfectly happy doing, but did you happen to see Sunday's edition in the current, I don't know if it was the front page section or the current section, where they had page after page after page of the history of police brutality against African Americans in the city of Philadelphia. Page after page after page, a chronology of the 100-year history of police brutality, completely ignoring what, as you justifiably stated, what's happening today in 2020 in the city of Philadelphia. And it is not police killing African Americans. It is African Americans killing other African Americans. It is, it's not even race any longer. It is Philadelphians killing Philadelphians. It's not police going after Philadelphians.
And Philadelphia is actually a pretty good, example to dispel a lot of the national myths. So, yes, I read that piece, and that piece was complete garbage. And it wasn't just garbage because of what's happening now in 2020. The piece is garbage because it doesn't, first things first, when they took bellwethers like you and Stu Bykowski off the Yankee, they did so in a way that they left a bunch of millennials or extremely biased, Helen Urbinus, people at that paper.
Yep.
And when they did so in a way that these people have no perspective. So let's not just talk about what's happening in 2020. Let's talk about that long history of quote-unquote brutality. Of course, they didn't get a counterpoint from Philadelphia police who worked back then. And they could say, oh, Rizzo was racist. No, Rizzo wasn't racist. I got a chance before he died to meet Tony Fullwood. In the 60s, this man could have picked anyone to be his right-hand man in the entire department. He picked an African-American gentleman, actually two African-American gentlemen. And, before actually superseding Wilson Good, he was known for making more command officials in the police and fire department who were African-American, the streets department who were African-American, than any other mayor in history coming up. So this is not a racist guy. But
he also didn't he also integrate the police force in the sense that in the 60s he was the first commissioner to put a black police officer, partner him with a white police officer so they could better manage the riots that were occurring in the inner city up in North Philly and other parts of the city.
Not only did he do that, he was the first guy to promote African Americans to district commanders. And he was the first guy. I mean, he led by example in that regard because Tony was essentially his partner. He was he placed him at the head of the protection unit, and anything, where are we going today, boss, was through Tony.
Yeah.
So, but the point I'm making is this: while we are quick to demonize Rizzo because he did use brutal tactics, he did use very old school head-knocking tactics on the Philadelphia Police Department that are unacceptable in today's vision. But you have to understand something. Philly, if you go to the King riots that swept the country in 1968, Philly is the only city in the country of that profile, that industrial blue-collar town that didn't riot and ruin itself. So when Newark was the pretty much rising star of the nation, it was an industrial superpower in Newark, New Jersey. It was going to be the next Detroit. And it rioted and everyone left. Yeah. And it hasn't recovered since. It's still bad 50 years later. Detroit still hasn't come back. Baltimore still hasn't come back. D.C. never came back. Everyone goes, oh, D.C.'s pretty. No, D.C.'s pretty in the federally controlled districts downtown.
Exactly.
But the industrial complexes, the defense industrial complexes, the contractors all went to Virginia and Maryland after the riots.
Right. No one who works in D.C., no one who works for the federal government actually lives in D.C. unless they live in Georgetown. Everybody else, as you said, lives in southern Maryland or northern Virginia.
Yeah. Virginia, yeah. I lived in Virginia when I was down. You can't possibly, afford Georgetown or, one of those neighbors, Shaw, on the kind of money that you're going to make with the government. And that's old money up there. So, yeah, but the point I'm making is, they demonize a guy, and the same thing if you're going through the 90s, the crack explosion era. Philly was too hands-on. Philly was brutal. Philly was, known for all these things. Yeah, but it was also a city that didn't go down the cycle that its peers went down to because people had a tangible fear of the criminal justice system. They didn't want to encounter the criminal justice system. And now that fear is gone, everyone's in the street holding up this false narrative that the police are racist and brutal while the streets are racist and brutal. And we're getting a 101 lesson on, hey, guys, this is what happens when the veneer of society is lifted.
Right. I want to quote you to yourself. You write, the city's response has not bolstered confidence in its ability to get crime under control. This is largely because the mayor, district attorney, and police commissioner have painted themselves into a woke corner, tying their own hands and leaving neighborhoods to fend for themselves with mixed messaging and hands-off policing and prosecution policies. Great line. And by the way, if you remember during the riots, and I'm calling them riots, they weren't peaceful protests, when the vandals were going out, they destroyed black-owned businesses in my parents' old neighborhood in West Philadelphia. So, these people, the African Americans in those communities are the ones who want law and order to be efficient and effective. They don't care about these woke policies of this, impotent mayor and his administrators. And it's unfortunate, as you write.
I write from a position of experience. I was a street cop in Washington, D.C. for, several years, starting in the late 90s. And I was on a job that was 75% African-American, policing a neighborhood that was over 90% African-American. I went to the community, the PSA meetings, and guess what? They wanted more cops. The people who go to those meetings are good citizens, not these protesters who just, the college-age white kids. Pew Research did a study that, 1 in 6 Black Lives Matter protesters is actually African-American. So, we got a lot of people who have no perspective.
Yep.
And what's worse is when they go to police these riots and protests, they're leaving places like North Philly and West Philly open. Like I've dealt with the same groups. They called them the Black Bloc anarchists in 99 and 2000. But when I used to deal with them, I was a civil disturbance unit officer in D.C., and they pulled me out of Anacostia to go into Northwest to hold these riot lines. Who do you think was policing Anacostia, which was the murder capital at one point? Nobody.
Yeah.
They basically tanked an African-American neighborhood. If Black lives really matter, they tell the protesters, your narrative is not sound, and we're going to start enforcing things like public order and nuisance and, parading without a permit.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I love what the mayor has done. He's, he's dismissing all of these citations and what have you. That may not be this horrible, horrible thing in the grand scheme of things. However, it's the optics, and it's this sense that, well, you know what, if you're protesting, anything is permitted. The same thing with, well, we're going to make sure that we don't have large gatherings because of COVID, but Black Lives Matter, those protests can take, and you made a really great point.
The double standard is offensive. And I don't agree. I think that they should be fined and they should be charged. That's the only way you can maintain a balance on this thing.
Yeah, you
and
have
they're
to
not
have fear.
major charges. But, the point is not just fear. It's, this stuff costs money that we don't have.
Well, you know what it is? Ben, the whole thing about, remember Rudy Giuliani and the broken windows theory in New York? That's what raised New York up to what it became, a safe, flourishing, thriving city. Now we've got the same thing down here. We're just going to let them break windows, essentially.
No, and that's not appropriate. And there is an actual, proof positive that our inspector general is completely asleep at the wheel at this town. when Kenny allows protesters to just vent, which never works. If you go to my Newsmax column, I had a great one during the riots called "Letting Them Vent Has Never Worked," and showed, going back to the L.A. riots, how that's a terrible tactic, but it's continually used by mayors who don't have the intestinal fortitude to get up there and say, guess what, guys, this is not acceptable. You need to stop because it's not politically feasible for them, right? Yeah. Meanwhile, a police car, so you take a $26,000, because they're buying them in bulk, Ford Explorer, and you add ballistic panels, you add a cage, you add equipment, you add, sirens. That's $100,000 that's being torched and wrecked, and no one's going to jail for it. And I'm sorry.
Yeah,
That's
and they call it property. It's property damage. Ben, we're up against the clock. This was a great, great interview. I'm only going to be here until Wednesday, but I know Chris will have you on again. You were amazing. How can people read your work? Give your website.
Yep. So follow me on Twitter is the easiest way because, people don't spell. At Public Safety SME, that stands for Subject Matter Expert, on Twitter. And you could reach me at Newsmax. Just put MANNES, my last name, in the column, or you could link it to the site or, whatever link you're going to have after the show, Chris. But, yeah, I have a Newsmax column called Public Safety Perspectives, and I post all my different works like the Broad and Liberty, the City Journal, and the BigTrial on my Twitter.
Fantastic. I think people absolutely out there listening in, you got to follow this guy. He's really smart. Ben, thank you. I appreciate it. Be safe.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
Take care.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Welcome
Ben
back.
This is Christine Flowers sitting in.